The air tasted like rot and steel, thick with the perpetual steam of the monsoon. But beneath the humidity, beneath the chlorophyll and the decay, I could already smell the faint, acrid ghost of cordite. It wasn't a recent smell. It was the residue of the last patrol, the lingering memory of metal fragments settling into the loam. A warning sign hung invisibly in the air. We were deep inside the green hell, 40 miles past any reasonable jurisdiction, moving toward the infamous Song Thao Bridge. That bridge wasn't just a crossing point. It was the umbilical cord that fed the northern staging areas, built precariously high over a river that moved like liquid concrete. More importantly, that bridge was our ticket home. Sergeant Rourke, Bull, as we called him, moved with the agonizing slowness of a man carrying a secret he couldn't share, his eyes constantly scanning the bamboo thickets where the shadows coiled like striking snakes. We were Alpha Team: Rourke, myself, Kincaid, the radio man, Doc Myers, Private Davies, fresh off the boat and still carrying the scent of PX soap, and Specialist Reyes, our demolitions wizard, who carried more C4 than rations. Reyes looked especially uneasy that morning. He kept running his callous thumb over the detonator cap taped to his pack. The mission was simple: confirm the size of the VC supply cache believed to be hidden downriver from the bridge, report, and wait for extraction on the western bank, right next to the structure. Simple, except nothing in this country was simple. As we reached the ridge overlooking the river, Rourke raised a fist, locking us down. The view was staggering. The river was swollen and brown, impossible to ford, swallowing banks whole. And there it was, the Song Thao Bridge, a masterpiece of rickety colonial engineering, swaying gently in the wind. But Reyes, squinting through the jungle haze, didn't look at the structure. He looked beneath it. "Bull," he whispered, his voice thin. "They got anti-personnel mines laced into the struts. And that wood, it's been sabotaged already. It'll hold trucks, maybe, but not much else." Rourke didn't even look back at him. He was staring at the dense, unnatural quiet emanating from the opposite bank. That quiet was worse than automatic fire. It meant planning. It meant patience. It meant we were walking into something tailored just for us. That bridge, our promised safety, suddenly felt like the crossbar of a vast, meticulously set trap, and we were the dangling meat. We hadn't even found the cache yet, and already Reyes was subtly shifting the C4 packages in his pack, the heavy blocks of plastic explosive seeming to radiate cold dread, knowing, perhaps before any of us, that the structure meant life, and the C4 meant death, and the two were about to become inextricably linked. The supply cache was exactly where intelligence said it would be, which, in the context of Vietnam, was the first flashing red light. It was in a natural depression about 500 meters downriver from the bridge, partially covered by massive, drooping ferns. When Rourke sent Davies and me ahead to confirm, we immediately knew something was fundamentally wrong. The crates weren't just standard issue AK ammo and rice. There were enough captured M79 rounds and US-made explosives to outfit a battalion, all stacked neatly, almost politely. There were no immediate defensive positions, no tripwires, just the cache sitting there, waiting to be found. It felt like a stage prop. I relayed the size estimate back to Rourke, keeping my voice low, the static crackling like frying insects. Bull came down with Reyes and Doc Myers, moving with a predator's caution. He didn't touch anything. He just circled the crates twice, his face hardening into granite. "Look at this," he finally muttered, pointing his K-bar at the ground. There were fresh tracks, maybe 2 or 3 men, but they were headed away from the cache, toward the northern jungle. They hadn't left in a hurry. They had walked calmly, deliberately, after setting up this immaculate display. Reyes knelt and examined the dirt. "Sir, they used a lot of manpower to move this stuff. Why leave unguarded? They're either waiting for us to call in a chopper, which they'll shoot down, or they want us to think we've disrupted their supply line before we even realize we're standing in the kill zone." Doc Myers, who rarely spoke outside of medical necessity, chimed in, "This smells like bait, Bull. Big, stinking, obvious bait. They probably expected us to linger, loot, or call in for massive airstrikes on the spot." Rourke stood up, his gaze drifting back up the ridge toward the bridge, the only stable path for 10 miles in either direction. That bridge was the objective, the choke point. Destroying the cache was secondary to preserving the crossing for future U.S. movements, per the explicit rules of engagement. But Rourke wasn't thinking about future movements. He was thinking about the present, about the 5 lives pinned under the monsoon-heavy sky. He knew the moment we called in the location, the main force would move. If the enemy could use that bridge to shuttle troops across rapidly, they could flank the entire sector and trap us against the current. The realization hit us all simultaneously. If the bridge stood, we were dead. If the bridge fell, we were isolated. The choice was agonizing, pitting immediate survival against the long-term mission parameters, a classic, cruel dilemma engineered by the jungle itself. Rourke drew a deep, shuddering breath, the decision already forming on his lips before he voiced it. We had to deny them the route, even if it meant sacrificing our own escape. The moment Rourke's order came, raw, barely audible over the rush of the water, it hung in the air like a death sentence. Reyes, get up there. Prep the span. We blow it in 10 minutes. Reyes didn't argue. He didn't even look surprised. He knew this was the only viable, albeit catastrophic, option. Davies, the new kid, looked green, gripping his M16 like a drowning man gripping a life raft. "Sergeant, that's our extraction point, sir," Command said. Rourke cut him off with a look that could stop a charging water buffalo. "Command isn't here, Davies. The VC are. If they get across that river, we're mincemeat. We deny them the route, period. Kincaid, you stay here and cover Reyes. Myers, Davies, you cover the northern approach." Reyes sprinted up the embankment, his pack suddenly seeming lighter despite the lethal cargo it carried. I watched him work, his movements precise and economical. He taped the slabs of C4 not to the central supports, but to the key stress points, the joints where the wood beams met the main cable stays. He knew exactly how to make a complete structural failure, not just a reparable hole. The detonator wire snaked back 75 meters, disappearing into the dense foliage near our position. When he returned, Reyes was pale, sweat streaming through the dust smeared on his face. "Charges set, sir. Fuses are damp, but the blasting caps look good. We have maybe 30 seconds post-detonation before the primary supports fail." Rourke nodded slowly, raising the handset. "Kincaid, radio check. Tell them the cache is confirmed. Large, and we're pulling out east. No mention of the bridge." "Not yet." I gave the standard sitrep, the lie tasting like rust on my tongue. Rourke took the handset, looked toward the swirling brown water, and then looked directly at Reyes. "Do it." Reyes flipped the arming switch, pulling the safety pin. He paused, his finger hovering over the plunger, a flicker of profound dread crossing his eyes. The realization that he was about to maroon 5 men in a jungle designed to kill them slowly. Then he slammed the plunger down. The air ruptured. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical blow, a sudden concussive fist hitting the chest. A massive pillar of brown water, pulverized timber, and dirt erupted high above the canopy. For a second, everything was smoke and thunder. Then silence. When the smoke began to dissipate, we saw the truth. The center span of the Song Thao bridge was gone. Twisted steel cables dangled uselessly into the churning current, and the main deck, reduced to splinters, was already racing downstream, consumed by the powerful flow. We had successfully executed the demolition. We had successfully cut ourselves off. Rourke let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since we landed in country. "Good. Mission accomplished," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. It was the sound of a man who had won the battle but lost the war. We stood there, looking at the ragged void over the river, the chasm separating us from civilization. When the first sound came, not the rustle of leaves, but the unmistakable metallic thunk of a mortar tube being dropped onto its base plate. The mortar fire didn't follow the blast immediately. There was a calculated, pregnant pause of perhaps 30 seconds, just long enough for the shock of the explosion to wear off, just long enough for us to start congratulating ourselves on the structural failure. Then the rhythmic thunk, thunk, thunk started. It was close. Too close. And it wasn't coming from the eastern side of the river, where we had assumed the main force was positioned to defend the cache. It was coming from the west dash, from the deep jungle we had just emerged from. Rourke's eyes went wide, his jaw muscles locked. They were already here. He breathed, the realization a physical punch. The cache wasn't bait for an airstrike. It was bait for us to waste time and ammo while they moved the main body across the river, just downriver from the bridge, probably using rafts or a temporary ford they've had set up for months. We hadn't cut off their escape. We had merely confirmed their successful maneuver, and in doing so, we had trapped ourselves against the impassable river with a determined enemy closing in. The first rounds fell short, spraying mud and bamboo shards near the destroyed cache site. The pattern was professional, calibrated. They knew exactly where we were. Everybody moved. Rourke roared, shoving Davies deeper into the undergrowth. We scrambled, adrenaline flooding the systemic exhaustion. We abandoned the cache, leaving behind the temptation of captured weapons and the security of the wide-open depression. The jungle closed immediately, suffocating the daylight. The enemy wasn't firing wildly. They were maneuvering, attempting to herd us further into the dense, thorny interior, away from the riverbank and any remote chance of a makeshift crossing. We heard the distinct, dry sound of AK-47 fire opening up to our north, cutting off the path back toward the bridge wreckage. They were setting up a perimeter. Davies, panicked, tripped over a vine, dropping his helmet. Doc Myers dragged him back up, shoving the sweaty fiberglass bowl back onto his head. We ran low, the humidity turning our fatigues into steaming shrouds. The air was a mix of pulverized earth, gunpowder, and a heavy perfume of fear. Rourke kept looking over his shoulder, his face a mask of self-recrimination. He had made the necessary move to destroy the bridge, but in the process, he had fallen for the far greater deception. The enemy had successfully used the most critical terrain feature, our escape route, as the primary component of their trap. They had calculated that the U.S. doctrine prioritized infrastructure denial over immediate troop safety when faced with a perceived large supply route. And they were right. We were now operating purely on instinct, plunging blindly into the jungle, knowing every step took us deeper into enemy territory and further from any hope of rescue. The bridge, now just a memory of splintered wood and churning water, was a constant, damning symbol of our self-inflicted isolation. The intense, focused engagement started less than 5 minutes after we fled the cache site, right as the mortars began to walk through the depression we'd abandoned. We ran headlong into a 3-man ambush team expertly dug into a spider hole concealed beneath a lattice of wet vines. The sudden shift from running to fighting was jarring. The jungle erupted into violence. The air filled with tracers, cutting through the shadows like angry red hornets. Reyes dropped instantly, his M16 spitting controlled bursts, taking down the first man before the VC could zero in. Rourke was bellowing orders, shoving us into cover behind the swollen trunk of an ancient banyan tree. Davies, terrified, returned fire, but his shots were wild, spraying leaf high above the enemy positions. Then a sharp, wet thwack sound, and Davies slumped against the tree, his breath whistling out in a rush. Doc Myers crawled toward him instantly, ignoring the heavy fire. "Leg," Doc grunted, tearing away the shredded fabric. Not arterial, but messy. Doc started working immediately, clamping vessels and wrapping field dressings, while Kincaid and Rourke provided suppressive fire. We were pinned down, fighting uphill against an unseen enemy that moved with terrifying fluidity through the dense foliage. Our position was untenable. We couldn't stay, and we couldn't retreat back toward the river. This entire scenario felt like a calculated exercise in futility. We had followed orders, or rather, Sergeant Rourke had made the only tactical choice that made sense given the overwhelming evidence of an impending logistical push by the enemy. Yet, we were still trapped, facing annihilation because the initial intelligence had been deliberately misleading. This wasn't just combat. It was a profound crisis of faith. We were fighting in a war where the enemy knew our rulebook better than we did, where the lines between objective and decoy were constantly blurred, and where every successful mission seemed to result in a greater personal cost. As I pressed my cheek into the damp earth, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the thick scent of Doc's antiseptic, I couldn't help but feel the deep, corrosive poison of disillusionment settling in. We blew our only way out to save the overall operation, only to find the operation had been designed to lead us right here. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? When a mission requires you to destroy your own lifeline, when you realize that even your escape route is just another piece on the enemy's chessboard, how do you redefine victory? Is survival the only true success? Or does the sacrifice always have to mean something bigger? Take a moment and consider. In a war like Vietnam, where tactical necessity often meant personal disaster, was Rourke justified in making the definitive choice to destroy the bridge, knowing the potential cost to us, the 5 men under his command? Share your thoughts below about where the line lies between the greater good and the responsibility to your squad mates. The firefight was brief, brutal, and decisive. Decisive only in that it forced us into an immediate, blind retreat. We managed to break contact after Reyes rolled a fragmentation grenade over the lip of the spider hole, silencing the ambush team with a heavy thump and a lingering cloud of smoke. Rourke didn't wait to confirm the kills. Move! South-southwest. We need high ground now. With Davies hobbling awkwardly, supported by Doc Myers, we plunged deeper into the jungle maze. The terrain immediately became exponentially worse. The ground was no longer firm dirt, but thick, waterlogged clay, turning every uphill climb into a desperate scramble. The vines and thorn bushes clawed at our webbing, slowing us down to a snail's pace, constantly catching the muzzle flashes of our weapons and the edges of our packs. Rourke was leading, cutting a path with his massive machete, leaving a visible, desperate trail that we couldn't avoid, but couldn't afford to worry about. He was silent, his movements tight, radiating an almost visible aura of concentrated guilt. He felt responsible for the disaster, even though the deception was not his fault. Yet, command was lonely, and he had made the final, irreversible call. We moved for what felt like 4 hours without stopping. The only sounds the labored breathing of the men, the squelching of boots, and the incessant drone of the jungle insects, which seemed to mock our terror. Davies' wound was slowing him down significantly. Doc Myers had done his best, but the jungle was fighting the field dressing. The air was thick with the metallic scent of old blood. We had to find a secure spot, and fast, before the infection set in or before the enemy trackers caught our scent. A certainty given the trail we were leaving. The jungle itself began to feel like the true enemy, a sentient being closing its green, humid fist around us. Every shadow was a sniper, every snap of a twig a signal. We were navigating by the sun filter through the triple canopy, moving blind, desperate, and entirely dependent on Rourke's strained intuition. The realization that the bridge, our fixed, predictable landmark, the singular point of hope, was gone, fundamentally altered our psychology. We were untethered, floating in a sea of nameless green, relying only on the bonds of the squad. That bond was the only thing preventing the total collapse into individual panic. We checked our ammo count, dangerously low. Water, critical. We were drinking stale, chemical-tasting water from the bottom of our canteens, filtering the brackish swamp seepage through handkerchiefs. Survival, now, depended on finding some anomaly, some geographic feature the VC might overlook, a hole to crawl into and hide until the weather broke enough for an air snatch that might never come. Just as Davy started exhibiting the first alarming signs of fever, his skin clammy, his breathing shallow, Reyes spotted it. Not a trail, but a deliberate absence of heavy undergrowth, leading into the side of a steep, overgrown hillock. It was too regular, too intentional to be natural. Reyes, always the keen-eyed engineer, pointed with his barrel. Tunnel entrance, bull. Crude but old. French era maybe, or a minor VC side route. It's too small for a squad to use for transport, but it's a hiding spot. The entrance was a low, dark hole, smelling faintly of mold and disturbed earth, barely large enough for a man to wriggle through on his belly. Rourke hesitated. Going into a tunnel system was suicide by claustrophobia and booby trap, but staying above ground meant certain death by the converging VC forces. We could hear the faint, echoing sound of distant shouts. They were sweeping the area. "We go down," Rourke ordered, his voice flat. "Reyes, you're on point. Look for air shafts, wires, anything." We spent 10 agonizing minutes widening the opening just enough for Doc to drag Davies inside. The moment we slid into the earth, the world changed. The heat was gone, replaced by a damp, subterranean chill. The absolute darkness was broken only by the thin beams of our flashlights, which cut through the oppressive blackness, illuminating walls of packed clay and the occasional startled, pale insect. The air was stale, reeking of old sweat, ammonia, and something metallic that made the throat constrict. We moved single file, crawling mostly Rourke and I providing rear security. The passages were labyrinthine, twisting and dropping sharply, sometimes forcing us to backtrack when a shaft ended abruptly in a collapse or a hidden water pool. The psychological impact of the darkness and the pressure of tons of earth above us was immediate. Reyes, who was usually unflappable, started breathing heavily, his flashlight beam trembling. He kept muttering under his breath, not about the traps he was searching for, but about the bridge. 30-second fuse. Why didn't I use 40? If I'd used 40, maybe we could have cleared the ridge. No, the mortars are already there. It had to go. It had to go. The immense weight of his actions, of destroying our only escape, was manifesting in a quiet, terrifying breakdown deep below the surface. We were trapped in a coffin of clay, facing not only the physical threat of the enemy above, but the psychological crumbling of the man who had bought us this temporary, terrifying sanctuary. The tunnel provided cover, but it exacted a heavy psychological price. Davies, delirious with fever, was murmuring incoherently, his words echoing strangely in the confined space. Doc Myers was struggling, stripped down to his t-shirt, applying a specialized salve to the festering wound, trying desperately to fight the sepsis that was beginning its march through the new kid's body. The air was so thick and foul that breathing was a chore, but the silence, broken only by our strained movements, was the worst enemy. We moved like ghosts, trying to suppress the sound of leather rubbing against clay, the scrape of metal on the tunnel ceiling. We hadn't encountered any organized VC resistance down here yet, only the scattered, primitive booby traps Reyes expertly disarmed. Pungy stakes laced with human feces and rudimentary pressure plates connected to old French grenades. But the absence of enemy soldiers meant they either hadn't discovered this specific entrance yet, or they were confident they could wait us out, smoking us out like rats in a sewer. Reyes, meanwhile, was spiraling. He was performing his duties perfectly, dismantling the traps, but his internal monologue about the bridge was escalating from quiet whispers to choked, panicked dialogue. He stopped suddenly at a narrow choke point, his body blocking the passage. It was beautiful wood, wasn't it, Bull? Strong, built to last 50 years. And I turned it into dust, into nothing. I took our only way out, and I made it zero. Rourke, understanding that he had to pull Reyes back from the edge, placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Reyes, listen to me. That bridge was an instrument of war, designed to move men and steel. You denied the enemy that weapon. It was a right call. The VC trapped us, not your C4. Do you understand? Your job is done. Now, Doc's job and my job are still ongoing. You need to focus." It was a desperate plea, not an order. Reyes blinked, the flashlight beam sweeping wildly across Rourke's face, illuminating the exhaustion etched deep around his eyes. He nodded, but the flicker of panic didn't entirely vanish. He was carrying the weight of the five of us, a burden made heavier by the thousands of tons of earth pressing down on him. We continued moving for another hour, sensing the tunnel sloping downward, away from the enemy's likely staging area. The cost of survival was becoming clear. It wasn't just physical endurance, but the ability to carry unimaginable moral guilt while maintaining functionality. Reyes had paid his toll up front when he pressed the plunger. Now we were all paying the installment plan, kilometer by kilometer, deep beneath the hostile jungle floor. We had traded the heat of the firefight for the slow, cold horror of burial alive. After an estimated 6 hours underground, the air began to change. A subtle shift, a faint hint of humidity mixed with chlorophyll, a sign that an air shaft or exit was nearby. Rourke pushed Reyes harder, knowing that Davies wouldn't survive another night in the fetid darkness. The tunnel finally widened into a small, naturally formed cavern, and then, twisting up at a sharp angle, we saw it, a tiny circle of gray light, partially obscured by roots. The exit. Reyes and Rourke worked together, scraping away the packed dirt and roots with their entrenching tools until the opening was just big enough. Rourke went first, easing himself out into the twilight. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the forest floor. The jungle felt utterly silent now, except for the distant, persistent sound of the Song Thao River, miles away, still churning with the wreckage of our lost escape. We emerged into a dense, secondary growth area, far downriver from our original position. We were miles off any navigable path, deep in terrain that wasn't even properly mapped. But we were out. Davies was pulled out last, unconscious but alive. Doc Myers checked his pulse. He needs evac yesterday, Bull. The fever's spiking. We huddled under a thick stand of ferns, the earth damp beneath us, trying to reorient. Rourke pulled out the tattered, mildewed map. The river flowed, generally south. We were on the western bank, the hostile bank, but the sheer distance we'd covered underground meant we were past the primary area of enemy concentration. We moved south, Rourke whispered. Follow the general direction of the river. Stay high. Avoid the low-lying swamps. We need to find a clearing, any clearing, and pray for a hole in the clouds for a chopper to spot us. As the last vestiges of light faded, Rourke spotted something that gave us a fleeting, desperate flicker of hope. Parallel tracks, barely visible beneath the ferns. Not boot tracks, but the deep, uneven grooves of old machinery. A logging road, Reyes muttered, his voice hoarse but steady now that he was in the open air. French, maybe? Abandoned 40 years ago. It was a crude, overgrown path, but it pointed generally southward, offering a vector, a direction, a tangible way forward instead of blind movement. We had destroyed our planned escape route, but the necessity of survival, coupled with sheer, dumb luck, had forced us into finding a new, forgotten path. The irony wasn't lost on us. The destructive act meant to prevent the enemy's advance had inadvertently pushed us onto a route that bypassed their entire forward operating sector. We were now ghosts moving through their territory, relying on a century-old scar on the landscape to lead us back to life. The logging path proved to be both a savior and a torment. It was marginally easier to walk than dense jungle, but it was linear, predictable, and had to be scouted meticulously for booby traps. Reyes was back to his old self, focused and methodical, scanning the ground ahead. Doc Myers and I took turns supporting Davies, whose weight was a dead burden. The infection had set in fully. He was delirious most of the time, calling out for his mother in freezing rain, things far removed from the sweltering jungle. We were forced to move at a creeping pace, covering perhaps 3 miles a day. The days bled into a monotonous, painful cycle of movement, rationing, and silent vigilance. The jungle began to strip us down, eroding not just our gear, but our identity. We hadn't seen a friendly face or heard the sound of a U.S. aircraft in nearly a week. We ate dry rice and captured hard candy weeds scavenged from the initial cache before the blast. Rourke, walking point, barely spoke. His guilt had transitioned from paralyzing terror to a cold, hard resolve. He was determined that all 5 of us would walk out, a self-imposed penance for the decision he'd made at the bridge. One afternoon, we stopped near a sluggish stream to refill our canteens. As Rourke watched the water flow, he finally broke his silence, his voice rough. "Kincaid, You remember what they said in the briefing? The Song Thao Bridge was the last stable crossing for heavy equipment into the high valleys. If the enemy secured that, they could shift the whole front line in a week. I nodded, wiping the grime from my eyes. Yes, Sergeant. That's why we were under orders not to damage it. Exactly, Rourke said, kicking a smooth river stone. But if we hadn't blown it, they would have rolled a battalion over it by now, and that entire sector would have been overrun. We blew our way out, yes, but we bought the 101st Airborne a week of preparation time. We succeeded in the mission objective, denying them that route. We just failed in the extraction planning. It was the first time he'd articulated the cost/benefit analysis that had been churning in his mind. The realization was sobering. We were suffering, trapped, and starving because the decision, however devastating to us personally, had been strategically sound for the greater conflict. We had been sacrificed, willingly or not, by the sheer necessity of the war, and the only comfort we could draw was the knowledge that our desperate choice had not been entirely in vain. The price of saving the front line was the slow, agonizing journey of 5 ghost soldiers through the enemy's backyard, guided only by an ancient, forgotten path.